Thank you for the invitation. I'd like to thank the friends from the Italian Buddhist Union for organizing this meeting in such a beautiful venue. We're hopefully getting out of a period where we could hardly move around. Hopefully we will be able to start moving around again and meet in person. This is already a Buddhist issue or topic, being gathered together in the same place, in the same time. And while it is true that you can understand each other at a distance, and the positive but also negative effects extend over distances and over space, it is also important to have times when we meet together in person. I'd like to thank the speaker for the words he shared with us before introducing me. I'd like to go back to a couple of points that are outside of my speech, and I refer to what Filippo Scianna said before. On the one hand, we have the importance of our relationship with universities. For Buddhism, studying is crucial, and sort of controversially, I would rather say that today the academic world needs to be prompted and stimulated, because sometimes if you work in that context, you have the feeling that many things are being done except for studying. You are obliged to do many more things. You mainly study outside of the university. So thanks to those who reminded us of this fundamental dimension, which has to deal with an ethical and not just an intellectual transformation. Another issue that Buddhism reminds us of, but not just the Buddhist tradition, the Christian tradition also has the experience of tradition at the heart. So these are paths that were set and given through translation, through languages. They taught us to think through languages, Pali, Sanskrit, Japanese, Jewish, Greek, Latin, on the other hand. So I'd like to thank also those who allow us today to speak in a language and be followed in a different language. I'll try to speak rather slowly against my nature, because I tend to become, very fast, to allow the interpreters to translate and therefore everybody to understand each other. Now, my presentation, my speech starts from a sort of awareness of what we are doing here. We are not participating in a retreat. We are not meditating. Although maybe before or after this meeting, for some of us, there may be a time for meditation practice. But a conference is a place where you talk. Buddhism has taught us to attach importance to words, but it also teaches us to mistrust those words that claim to say everything, to define and to exhaust a lively experience in a concept. I'm not a Japanese expert, so my friends and masters will correct me. I studied Japanese thinking a lot, but from a philosophical viewpoint. My specialty is philosophy, and I teach philosophy at the university. For philosophers, language is obviously the key instrument for practice. It's the means through which we try to build a way, a path, a Tao, or a Do, because it's also a transformation practice. Now, the relationship between experience and language, not just in Zen, which I take as a special case because I know this tradition a bit better, but I don't really want to be highly specialized on some specific authors or on one tradition. I'll try to start from there to then try to develop a theme, an issue, or a question. The relationship between experience and language has been debated extensively. So in a way, there's nothing new to that. But I believe that today it is crucial and urgent to put this topic at the heart of the discourse. A text by David Loy has been translated recently. Ubi Liberi is the publishing company devoted to Buddhism. The title is Eco-Dharma. It has to do with ecology and Dharma, the Buddhist Dharma. One of the issues that come to the surface is how to be Buddhist and how Buddhism may affect and cooperate with a transformation that should not be individual only, but needs to touch and affect and transform shared practices. Practices which draw inspiration from personal transformation, but it's a type of practice that morphs our lives and changes our life. But they also intervene, for instance, in the political domain. This means getting into the public arena, in the arena of public debate. It means that the experience of meditation practice should, to some extent, change our way of communicating or communicating us to others to talk and to provide arguments. So the starting point is the following. How can we stay between, this is a calligraphy character by a Japanese master, Aida, what is between? So it's a preposition, but it's also an action almost. It's a movement. It has no substantive correlated to it. Western thinking finds it hard to translate and conceptualize this kind of kanji or character, because the thinking, writing, and language that we use in the West are based on names and nouns. It was built on the basis of nouns and definitions, whereas the Japanese and Chinese thoughts are based on flow, on the process, on transformation. When we talk about Zen, we have, so to speak, inherited a pronunciation. There is no precise pronunciation of these 4 verses, which there's no authors of them, but they might be useful to frame the Zen school or Zen practice. Kencho Jotsu Kyonjebetsu Den. So we could translate a special teaching that lies outside of the writings, outside of the written or textual communication. It's outside, not because it refuses writings, but because it does not depend on them, or it's not mainly and primarily based on written texts. It's not based on text or words. Text or words, that's my translation, but it could be characters and writings. Monji indicates the dimensional sign also in literature and sinagrams. It's not above, it does not rest on text or words, but it indicates or points directly to the heart. So that's the target, kokoro in Japanese. Heart, mind, the intimate, the inner dimension of the human being, and see the intimate nature to realize Buddhity. These 4 verses might trigger 2 hours of comments, but there's one thing that comes to the fore to me. The fact that it's not text-based or the fact that it's not based on words is key. In modern tradition of dissemination of Zen, this aspect has been placed at the heart, to some extent also as a contrast vis-à-vis the excessive use of words and verbalization which characterizes Western thinking. The fashion of the 50s and 60s made not only Zen but also other Asian traditions, they made them popular in Europe and the United States. Also made sense also in terms of rebalancing what turned out to be unable to stop the disasters of the 19th century. So the Western tradition could not stop two world wars. They couldn't stop Nazi lagers or atom bombs. So you needed to foster another type of knowledge. And perhaps that kind of knowledge had to, detach itself from words and language. What was appreciated and is still appreciated of Zen, and it's not wrong to say that it's the practice of Zazen, of sitting meditation, which is the core of that practice. We know that many masters and monks wrote and talked, and in a way, as I will say in a while, there are language-based experiences which are typical of Zen, that Zen offers as a gift. So it's not that there is no language whatsoever. It's not totally discarded. But language, in a way, is moved against itself, or rather against any claim whereby the logical argument may, after all, encase truth. The truth is not in judgment or in a sentence or in a preposition. This is also true for some Western philosophers, but anyway, it's certainly true that the experience of meditation prompts us to go beyond this rational or cerebral tradition whereby I can really capture and possess truth simply by speaking it or writing books or learning from texts. Here we may actually open another larger scenario, which is the meeting of the Zen experience in the thinking of some contemporary Japanese philosophers. One among many, the most important, is Nishida Kitaro, one of the most important of the 1900s, who wrote in the preface of his first important text, which is not a book on Zen. For those who are not experts of Japanese culture, Zen no Kenkyu, that's a Japanese title, has a nomophone of Zen as his first words in the Buddhist school. This is a different character, which means good, implemented or realized good. So it's not a text on Zen meaning Buddhism, but certainly Nishida's thinking has acquired some elements of Zen. He was a practitioner of Zen. And he wrote, it's not that since there is an individual, there is the experience, but since there is the experience, then there is the individual. And the experience is more fundamental of individual experiences. So it's producing a sort of fork or opening between a tradition that puts subjectivity in the first place, that does experience, has the experience and produces knowledge and reflects on its own experience. And this type of conception which dominates Western modernity, where the subject is the basis and the reflection, the cogitatio, Descartes is the main player of this season that opened up modernity. So cogito, so I think, and therefore I speak. There is a language that allows me to think of myself and to recognize myself. Therefore, there is an experience. So language is fundamental. Nishida said something different. He said you first have an experience that then is determined at its at a later time it becomes tangible. A metaphor that is also often used is the relationship between the ocean and the waves. We tend to isolate the ocean and think of the ocean as a number of waves, whereas he is saying there is the ocean first, and then from the ocean, what you have is a series of waves. But waves are part of the ocean, invariably. There is no wave that can claim that it is the ocean, even if every individual, every single wave is part of the ocean. There is a sort of exchange or movement between the experience that happens immediately and its purity. So not mediated by linguistic categories and language, which to some extent describes that experience, makes it aware for the subject who feels it. The experience of the so-called awakening, satori, or enlightenment could be described at the same time as an understanding of the reality of things, their intimate reality, or as a communion with the finite nature of the waves of the ocean, which has effects also over time. Because the experience of awakening, the awakening as an experience is something that translates and is offered in your daily life, also in the continuity of the experience as narrated, as shared. But at the same time, the experience goes beyond time. It goes over and beyond the dimension of time. It's a sort of infinite now, infinite minutes, where time and space explode or are intertwined. You cannot talk about what is beyond time. You can only experience it. And the experience must be then embodied and translated into gestures. But then how can you think of describing or communicating an experience by totally excluding the experience of language? The human being is also made of language. So in Zen, they came up with a strategy. So they use language, but in a paradoxical manner. It's used in a way that nobody can rely or rest on it, thereby basing their own experience of awakening on the dimension of arguing or argumenting. So we are far from the philosophical experience, apparently, because it works on arguments. If there are no logical arguments, you're outside of the philosophical domain. But perhaps there is a possibility for a link, for a connection, to the extent that while it's true that you share your thinking through words and sentences, and while it's true that an experience is limited or reduced when language aims at fixing it, but it's also true that language has the power to go beyond itself. It may become a bridge or a springboard. If I cling on the bridge, I would not go further. But if the bridge is something that I walk through to the extent that I need it, then it allows me to cross a river, a lake, or a road. There is another analogy here that, in my opinion, may relate to the experience of meditation with the experience of language. But again, these are just thoughts that I put to you. These are not answers, they're just questions. In my opinion, in meditation, what we have in meditation and in language, we have instruments, but both the meditation practice and the language practice, from some viewpoint, they are already part of the authentic experience of awakening. It all depends on the way in which we put ourselves into them. As far as meditation practice, I mean, I'm supported by giant authors. If we read some of Dogen's texts, this is exactly the concept that he underlines. Practice and awakening are joined. They are ichignon, shu sho ichignon. So they're one and the same thing, practice and realization. Whereas we basically have an idea of language as a sort of trade union, like the letterman, someone transporting a parcel or a package. Also in the translation, we have this idea there is an ideal content pronounced in Italian, translated into English, and it's transferred, transposed. This metaphor works to some extent, but as a matter of fact, every thought develops in a language and transforms into a different language. And language is not just a neutral means, a non-influential vehicle. If I make a real experience of language, of the essential dimension of language in every language spoken by human beings, then the experience of language is one that may become transformative itself. Of course, it's different to say, open the door, or in an IKEA box, assemble a screw with a plank. Well, talking about the issues of life, birth, death, correlations, interrelations, it's a totally different thing. But when we touch on these topics, the dimension of language becomes really hot in a way. That's a context in which language should appear to be not just a neutral instrument claiming to possess contents and concepts, but language is something that helps us to experience those contents. When language is transformed by an experience, it becomes life message. And words are not just labels that we put on things. This is one of the most famous quotes from one of the most important sutras in the Mahayana tradition, in which we oscillate with this almost untranslatable word in Western languages, shoku, immediately, or however, on the other hand, emptiness and form, a phenomenon, the figure, are interrelated. If I claim that the language fits what is emptiness and what is form, if I were fixed on a potential definition, a definition limits, determines, and closes, this kind of sentence, if logically analyzed, would make no sense. And this is a typical interpretation of most of Western thinkers who do not really get in touch with the Buddhist practice and experience, and therefore they discard this type of formulations as unlogical, non-significant nonsense. Conversely, this is exactly where language induces a practice. So you have to be into this kind of experience. If you're not Chinese or Japanese, it means opening up to another form of rationality. I'm not saying that everything becomes rational or rationalizable. It's good to have a stimulus there for rationality to open up to what cannot be rationalized. But I don't want to fall into the trap by saying that this formulation has got nothing to do with reason and with thinking. I have thinking in such high esteem, and the experience of thinking, I value it so much that I do not think that thinking is not just something that blocks and rationalizes. So it obviously depends on the extension of the concepts that we use. If I have an idea of thought, of the experience of language, if I have a limited, small, enclosed vision of that, then probably I'm not willing to include also this kind of language practice in thinking experience that goes beyond rationalization but becomes part of a more integral experience, which is bodily, which is linked to breathing, and it's connected with life, because life is life to the extent that it does not coincide with itself. If I want to fix life, I lose it, exactly like awakening, exactly like Dharma. The Buddhist experience tells us that when things go well, when things work out, Buddhism is a path that deconstructs itself because it prevents us from possessing it. Because in order to work and to generate life and produce good fruits, it empties itself. This doesn't mean that it becomes insignificant or meaningless, but in the sense that it cannot be fixed. All religious and philosophical traditions, I believe, aim at this type of practice. They aim at something that, to the extent that it is crossed and becomes alive, doesn't need to be fixed. It's no longer a label or an idol. It has a very strong anti-idol value, which is reflected in this connection between experience and language in Zen. Uega Shirotero, a Japanese master and philosopher who died a few years ago, correlated the practice of language of Zen masters with, amongst others, the epitaph of a great poet, a German-speaking poet, Rose, oh reiner Widerspruch, Lust, niemand schlaft zu sein, unter so viel Lieder. Rose, oh pure contradiction, desire to be sleep of nobody under so many eyelids. And Ueda indicated in the oh and the sense of suspension, it's a word that is not translated. It has no conceptual meaning. It could be compared to aware in Japanese Buddhism, this sense of awe and wonder that cannot be contained or cannot be defined. And it is in this type of linguistic or language experience that you have the potential conjunction between a practice that cannot be reduced to a language and a language which becomes lively practice. This is a conjunction, an experience that should be considered if we don't want to let the dimension of the practice to be on the one hand, on the one side, and the dimension of our language to sit on the opposite end. Otherwise, if we go back as the 10th image of the 10 Tori, it's a series of paintings that in the Zen tradition illustrates the path of a disciple towards the awakening. The 8th image is emptiness. The 10th image is going back to the market with openings. What do you do in the market? You talk to each other, you shake your hands, you bargain. That dimension cannot be separated from awakening. Otherwise, we would split in a dualistic manner. Francesco talks about duality, funi in Japanese, which is fundamental. Otherwise, we would separate practice, zazen, that we practice in the temple or during session or at home. We would split it and separate it from daily life, which couldn't be farther from the experience that Buddhism wants to share and deliver. Why is that so crucial? Because, as I said in the beginning, Buddhism has been studied so far, and it has also partly been practiced with the conviction that practice produces in a subject that desubjectivizes himself, a subject that becomes empty of himself, this idea of transformation of self, which implies the idea of transforming what is beyond the self, of course. But as I said in the beginning, we live in a time when between the pandemics, the climate change, the weather issues, ongoing wars, we need to be able to be equipped with instruments that affect and allow us to discuss the economic and political basis of those wars and pandemics and climate changes. I'm not downgrading the importance of practice, but I'm trying to think that one way of practicing today, even more important perhaps, in the interconnection that we experience across the world, is exactly the practice based on words, which allows us to get into the political arena and to have a discussion or have a dialogue with the domain of economics. Otherwise, the risk is to separate two planes. On the one hand, you have the practice, transformation in silence, and on the opposite end, we have what we can do to foster public debates when we manifest or express our ideas, whereas the slow maturation induced by Buddhist thinking is, in my opinion, something not really totally new, but something that studies have not underlined sufficiently so far, and it is exactly the possibility to be in the language, as if language were a practice. A small example of how fundamental language is also in translation or transformation from one language to another. This is a poem by Goethe in German. Here you have also the translation into Italian and English. In the second verse, the word that Martin Heidegger, a German philosopher, considered to be the most important in this poem is the verb to be, ist Ruhe. It's quiet. And in the dimension of poem, according to Heidegger, the fundamental sense of this poem is the ontological dimension. The writing, the words encapsulate the basic meaning. When Nishida translated it into Japanese for a friend, Uke Shoujo, he translated the poem, but there is no verb to be. He translated it in a way that the main accent is on the general allusions of this poem. I will not get to the details. I just wanted to show you that an element that could be considered to be fundamental in the culture, philosophy, and sensitivity of German disappears in a different language. This is another crucial aspect in our contemporary world for Dharma Today. We cannot think that there is a language that that covers the entire range of human experience. We cannot think that there is one language that is more important than others, although we may choose one language to communicate in the international community, but we have to recognize the importance of the multiplicity of languages, because all of them may deliver and convey different aspects. So it's as if it were a multifaceted crystal, like the Dharma. We can only see 2 or 3 faces, but never all of them together. Or it's like a white light refracted through a prism. So we only see one particular wavelength, yellow, green, blue. Nobody owns the totality. Truth is not something that you own or possess. It's something that you experience gradually, but also goes through words. Another example, a new way of understanding the same words. The beginning of one of the most important texts of the collection of Dogen's writing, a Buddhist master of the 13th century. So this is the rewriting of a famous sentence in the Buddhist tradition, which is reinterpreted. This is a traditional sentence. Sentient beings all have the Buddha nature. Tathagata resides forever without ever changing. And Dogen reinterpreted that sentence this way. Everything is living. In Japanese, there is no verb to be. This is a reinterpretation of that sentence. This is the experience of awakening that makes language alive, that goes through language. Everything is living. Every entity is the nature of Buddha. Tathagata resides perennially. It's nothing. Its entity is change. This is a potential translation, but allows us to get into the laboratory of a great master who practiced meditation, who based his experience of practice in Zazen, but who knew that words too have a fundamental value, and words can include new meanings, and they can add life to our experience. Otherwise, we would be deprived of a fundamental instrument, which is not an instrument. As long as we think of it as a means, we cannot experience it. I will conclude with this image of a circle that doesn't completely close, because we shouldn't think that either something is perfectly accomplished and perfectly fitting, and is there without any opening, or that dimension is a failure. We should rather think that even when you have a fixture, a fall, a stumbling, then there is practice or a potential possible experience of truth. Even with our words that make us stumble or make us misunderstood, also considering the difficulties of translating from one language to another, from one experience to another, we can learn to build new relations. Those fixtures, those cracks that may look like defects or blocks could actually become spaces to go through and access new types of realities or truths. They show us new gaps that we can go through. We need to build new bridges and open up new paths in today's world. And language is one of these possibilities. When it is transformed by a practice, language becomes itself an opportunity for truth, an occasion of truth. What is important is to have a sort of radical involvement and commitment. That's the basic issue. To what extent is the language that I speak the result of an authentic experience? To what extent are the effects of the words that I say expand and produce new fruits? So again, Similarly to the Zen practice and meditation, the practice of language finds its test bench in the relation with others, in the possibility to build together habitable cities or life on this planet, and a possibility to also open new scenarios, taking on responsibility for our neighbors and those who will come after us. Thank you very much.